Agatha Christie's Poirot, starring David Suchet, is a much-loved British mystery drama. I grew up with it, my son has grown up with it, so you can imagine my joy when Brian Eastman, the producer of the show, agreed to be my guest for tonight's special online event presented by the Art Deco Society UK. Brian is a BAFTA and Emmy award-winning TV and film producer whose successes include Jeeves and Wooster, Rosemary and Thyme, Blot on the Landscape, Porterhouse Blue, Shadowlands with Richard Attenborough, and of course Agatha Christie's Poirot. There is so much to learn about how a TV programme is made, and there is no better person to ask than the producer himself. Brian kindly invited me to his home to tell us more about the making of Poirot. Well, thank you, Brian. Very warm welcome. Thank you for joining the Art Deco Society and myself, Kate, and the members for the making of Poirot.
Oh, thank you, Kate. Thank you for asking me.
I want to start at the very beginning. In simple terms, for everyone watching, what is a producer?
Well, the definition varies quite a lot depending what's being made. But in the world I worked in, I was a producer of movies and of television and of theatre shows. And in my case, because we had an independent production company, it was all about coming up with ideas and developing those ideas so that you could then persuade somebody to pay you to make those ideas. In the case of Agatha Christie's Poirot, well, it had a bit of an unusual beginning. I had worked with David Suchet on Blot on the Landscape. We did 3 Tom Sharp adaptations over a few years, Blot on the Landscape, Porterhouse Blue and Wilt. And I met Agatha's daughter, Rosalind Hicks, who said to me that she thought she'd seen Blot on the Landscape and she thought David would make an excellent Poirot. And so I then began a discussion with her and the Christie Estate agent about how to make a television series, what we would base it on, what they were willing to have it based on. And eventually we settled on a few of the short stories, and I then met a writer called Clive Exton, who had been a very successful writer in Britain before he'd gone to Hollywood, but he got fed up with the life in Hollywood, as a lot of Brits do, and came back to London, and this was the first job he did in London, writing an adaptation of The Adventure of Johnny Waverley, which was one of the short stories. So being a producer is trying to have that idea and find a way forward with it. So I had the support of the Christie Estate and I had Clive's script. So then it was a question of, well, could I find a British broadcaster that would pay for that? And you can never quite remember the toing and froing of selling an idea to broadcasters. I'm pretty certain I did take it to the BBC because they had just done the Joan Hickson Miss Marples. And I can't quite remember why they said no. You tend to blank it out of your mind. People say no, so you just move on to the next one. But I then took it to London Weekend. This was in the days when ITV was still regional franchises. Right. And obviously I was working in London. They were the London Weekend company. Thames were the London Weekday company. I think I must have thought that it was definitely a weekend show rather than a weekday show. And fortunately they were interested. In fact, I had 2 things that I managed to persuade them to do at the same time. The Poirots, and we had a series with John Alderton and Pauline Collins called Forever Green.
Oh, yes.
And I persuaded I think what I actually said was I wasn't willing to do Poirot unless they also did Forever Green. But they were keen to do both because John and Pauline had been big successes on London Weekend in the past. So then you, as a producer, you shift into a different mode. You've had the idea, you've got the main ingredients, in our case the star and the script, and then now you've got the money. So now you move into the position of, well, how do you spend the money and how do you make the most of what you've been given? And that gets down to a lot of detail. Where do you want to shoot? How much time are you going to allow for shooting? How much money are you going to spend on actors? All of those sorts of things. And that's all in television what a producer does. It varies a little bit in movies. Sometimes some of those decisions move more onto the director rather than the producer. In television, it's more of a partnership, but the producer hires the director, but you only really hire somebody who is in sympathy with the way you want to do it. And then, the director does make a lot of day-to-day decisions. But if as a producer you think the director is not shooting it or preparing it in the way you want it to go, you obviously have a conversation with them and try and come to some amicable arrangement. I mean, sometimes you don't, and sometimes you part company, but not very often. And so, as a producer, you then supervise all of that, and it's your job to not spend more money than you were given. So we're under the auspices of the Art Deco Society, and that was one of the ways I wanted to spend the money. I wanted to get 30s architecture into the stories, and that was all based on Rosalind, Agatha's daughter, showing me a little piece of publicity that had been written for publicising Agatha's books in America. And it was this strange little thing. It was a letter, supposedly a letter from Poirot to his American publisher. Well, it's a weird idea, isn't it? Because he's the fictional character. You could imagine it might be a letter between Agatha but no, there's this letter from Poirot to the American publisher, which Rosalind told me was written by Agatha. Subsequently, I have been told that that's possibly not the case. But anyway, what it is his own little biography, telling people what's important to him and where he came from and all of that, sort of distilling all the elements that are in the Poirot books. But one of the most important things, he says, is how he loves the clean lines of 30s modern architecture, and how he, in this letter, says he lives in a flat that is very sparsely furnished, that has all mod cons and lovely curved lines and how this reflects the order and precision that he wants in his own life. So, of course, we thought, well, that's perfect then. We'll try and do that with the architecture. And so I decided to spend quite a lot of the money that we had available on the show featuring that type of architecture.
If we could talk about that flat, because Whitehaven Mansion, which was Florin Court, is that correct?
Yes, that's right, in Charterhouse Square.
So was that easy to find? Did you have that in mind, or is it someone recommended it? And did you have to clear it out a lot to dress it? What was the story?
We spent a lot of time trying to find a building that we thought Poirot would live in. And we did a lot of research. I'll show you, there's a couple of very good books that we used a lot at the time. This one in particular, Britain in the 30s.
Look at that.
Which detailed a lot of building that was done in the 30s, obviously. And we had somebody go round and actually identify which of those buildings was still surviving. We wanted it to be in central London because that's where we were shooting. So we came up with a list of about 20 or 30 of those buildings that were still in reasonable condition in London, and we went to look at lots of them. But the advantage of Florin Court was that it was, at the time we wanted to film, it was empty. Can you believe that? Whole building was empty. It had been built in the 30s and nothing had been done to the building. What year am I talking about now then? About 1987, 1988, that sort of thing. And it had been bought by a developer, and they were just in the process of modernising all the apartments in there.
Good timing then.
I know, it was very, very lucky timing. And we said to them, well, if we come for a whole weekend, will you stop work and can we have access? We're only talking about exteriors. We were never going to shoot the interior there. No. The interior was built in the studio.
Right.
But we were doing 10 episodes and they would all feature exterior moments outside the building. So we did all of those episodes over a long weekend, shooting day and night. And we did lots of establishing shots with lights on in different windows, and we decided which flat was going to be Poirot's. So, there's one shot which is used in a particular episode where he's working in the middle of the night, and you see the whole building with just this one light on. And then we did other night shots with several lights on. And I don't know if you remember, early on, there used to be a commissioner there, Mr. Dicker, he was called, and there were various scenes of Poirot going in and out, talking to Mr.
That's
Dicker.
Right. I suddenly thought of another scene as well when he bought the typewriter for Miss Lemon.
Oh, right.
And he looks up, he gets out the taxi.
Yeah.
So is that another...
Yes, yeah. We would have done that all over that weekend. And we never went back there until about 15 years later.
Really?
Those shots that we did that weekend kept us going for the first 8 or 9 years. Then there was a bit of a gap, and we only went back there for the murder of Roger Ackroyd, where Poirot, according to the Christie story, has retired to the country, which we didn't really want him to be from our point of view, but we had to follow the book. But we invented a story where he goes back to the flat. And he goes with Inspector Japp, and all his furniture's covered in dust sheets and everything, and so we got going again with the flat then. But that was the last time that we went back there. That's
incredible! A whole weekend you managed to do that.
I know. It was. We had 2 crews, a day crew and a night crew, and I seem to remember I was there for both. And David was doing all these different scenes from different episodes because we knew we just wouldn't get the access again to it.
No, exactly.
And shortly after that, they finished the refurbishment and the flats went on sale. I have been inside since, just when David finally finished making the whole series. There was a nice little documentary about it all, and they invited me to go and supposedly meet David outside Charterhouse Square, and we then went into one of the flats and shot a scene with us reminiscing about the show up there. Yeah. But the flats, they've kept a little bit of the 30s feel in there, but they've been more modernised, of course. Yeah. There was one little scene which I thought was, I wrote down where the place was. There was just one tiny little sequence of Poirot going into a building, but I thought it was the best place we ever used. There it is, the Finsbury Health Centre off the Farringdon Road.
Yeah,
well,
like
what that has, which was a very important feature for us, curved glass blocks.
Yeah.
And a lovely 30s reception desk. I think it's only one little scene, but the way, I think it was Ivan Strasberg, the director of photography, the way he lit it as well, it just looked absolutely perfect. And we bought a whole ton of glass blocks ourselves, and we used to use those in other sets that we built for the show. So the glass blocks are probably the most typical thing that we used, because the way the light comes through the glass blocks is very, very effective. And if somebody walks behind them, you get this very twisted shadow that goes through. And I don't think you see glass blocks in what would normally be called an Art Deco building. I think you see them more in a 30s modern building.
Right.
But but that was probably the standout feature that we had.
Yeah, and where was that? The health centre? Where was it located?
Off Farringdon Road,
Right.
Finsbury Health Centre. It's called. I mean, we shot there 30 years ago, so hopefully it is still there, whether it's in that condition. I did notice the other day, there's a place we used to use quite a lot, the Royal Masonic Hospital down in Hammersmith, and I saw that turned up in a more recent film. They tend not to use it as a 30s location, they just use it as a modern location, but it has this very distinctive look to it. There were several places that we used to go back to a bit just because they were so suitable for us. But because I had this list of good 30s buildings in London, I tried to use them all gradually. We'd work our way around. And sometimes we wrote scenes specifically for buildings that we were trying to use. So, no, we were lucky to do that.
Yeah, well, I'll have to ask the Society, because that's another part of their work in preserving Art Deco buildings. So they'll know whether that's still surviving, which hopefully it should be. And if it's not, they'll put a petition up to stop it from being pulled down, which, of course, does happen. That's,
of course. Although they're pretty good at putting preservation orders on good examples of things now, aren't they?
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, and there's an example of the Ovaltine building. I don't know if you knew about that, where they made Ovaltine, and they had preservation on that. So when it got turned into flats, they couldn't get rid of the sign. So it says Ovaltine outside with the flats, and it looks lovely.
Yes. You wouldn't want to throw that away,
you
would
wouldn't, definitely not. Let's talk about my favourite of the other elements that were so important, like Hastings Lagonda. How did they find beautiful cars like that? Was that a difficulty, or?
Old cars, there are quite a lot of people who specialise in that, and we wanted not only the buildings to have the 30s modern feel to it, but we wanted the cars and the trains and in some cases the ships, because we did a Queen Mary episode once, didn't we? To all have that same feel to it. So we chose the Lagonda because we thought that had the right quality to it. Yes, it's a lovely car. I don't know where it is now. I'm sure the owner's probably still got it. I think it was in private hands, but you in the film industry, the people who rent you cars know where to find those sort of vehicles.
They were very iconic, with the dressing of the set. That's an interesting thing that not everyone would know, that wasn't actually in the flat, that was in the studio.
Yes.
But it looked beautiful.
Yeah, it does. We had to replicate the curved window. And one of the things that you never really think about when you're preparing is, we're going to build the flat in the studio and we'll make it a replica of the real place, but we'll make it a bit bigger so that we can shoot in there properly. And we'll introduce this little hatch between his office and Miss Lemon's office so that they can talk between the hatch and that sort of thing. So you've got these great expanse of windows, and then one day they say to me, okay, well, we're going to shoot in there tomorrow. What do you want to see outside the windows? What do you mean? And I said, well, when we light it, you're going to be able to see out there. What do you want to see? And then you're into the whole question. In those days, would you have a painted backdrop? Or do you build a little model or something? These days, they just put it all in by CGI, but in the 80s, you had to do something physically. Well, what we decided in the end, which was a bit of a compromise, because I was not a fan of painted backdrops.
No.
I think
quite static as well.
Yes, and also, however well they're done, they don't really look like real life. So we said, well, what we'll do is we'll just have net curtains and we'll light it in such a way that you don't see out of those net curtains.
Let's talk a bit more about the cast themselves. We'll talk more about Poirot and Hastings and their chemistry, but what about, they're referred to as the family, aren't they? Poirot, Hastings, Miss Lemon and Inspector Jack.
Yeah. Was
that an easy, natural process getting that cast together? Did you have people in mind for each of that? I know David obviously was, but how did that happen? Was that an easy process?
No, we didn't. Apart from David, we didn't have anybody particularly in mind when we started, and we met I guess we met 20 or 30 actors for each of those parts. And that's certainly how we met Hugh and Pauline. I think what happened with Inspector Jack was we did meet quite a lot of people and we were not quite sure about how we wanted to play it. And I think one of the directors said, "What about Philip Jackson?" And I can't remember whether we even asked him in, because we all then thought that was a very, very good idea. I think we might just have offered it to him straight away. I can't remember. And I mean, just all three of them turned out to be brilliant in it. So we were
perfect.
We
Such
were very,
magic.
Yeah, they really were very, very good. And the scenes with the four of them, are some of my favourite scenes. And we had to take, a bit of a license with the Christie stories, because then, although all four characters, the three additional ones are in the books, they're not necessarily in all the books all the time. Because the short stories, which were the basis of the 1 hour episodes, needed a lot of invention. The short stories are often very, very simple. That gave us a way to introduce the family characters as well. That was a bit easier. When it came to adapting the novels, because there's so much plot in a Christie novel, and you're trying to shrink it down to a 2-hour television slot, that was a bit harder to get the family in, because you were having to keep the plot going. Whereas in the short stories, you could allow yourself a bit of indulgence about, Miss Lemon's cat, or Hastings' adventures up the Amazon, or something like that. The Orinoco, I think, rather than the Amazon.
Yeah. Did you look to find that chemistry, that special chemistry between Poirot and Hastings, or did that happen naturally? Because they really did have a chemistry on screen, didn't they? David Suchet and Hugh Fraser. It was just magical.
Well, I think the one thing we thought about it was that Hastings should not be an idiot.
No.
And if you look at some of the things he says and does, you could interpret him as an idiot, but we definitely thought he wasn't. And I think one of the reasons why we chose Hugh was that I think when we were talking to him about it, he really emphasised that he did not want to play it as an idiot. And I think that was the key to their relationship. He had a different perspective on things to Poirot, and he probably had the perspective that you or I might have, given the circumstances they found themselves in. So he was a sort of everyman rather than a fool. But I mean, we did give him some comedic lines that allowed
Which he delivered very well.
He did, yes. And again, he did it without you thinking, "Oh, what a twit," when he said it. You just thought, "Oh, I can see why he thinks that," but perhaps not the brightest thing to say at that stage.
It was his comic timing, and it was almost like there might be people watching that might be thinking the same. So it wasn't idiotic. It was just mentioning the obvious, and he did that very well.
Yes, he did.
Yeah,
he was really good at it, and he and David got on very well, and. I mean, David is a very good comedic actor as well. I mean, it's funny to be talking about comedy in the context of Agatha Christie, but I think, in a way, that was one of the secrets of the show's success, that in amongst all the murders and everything, you could have a smile or even a chuckle at some things. Yeah.
Let's talk a bit about the music. Christopher Gunning.
Yeah.
One of the things I personally, as a musician, songwriter, love is the way the music was played throughout. The incidental music was just so wonderful how it was used. But I also liked it when there was a little twist. When there was the episode, the jewel robbery at the Grand Metropolitan, where it was the brass band playing the music, so it gave that seaside quality. I really loved that.
I know, it was a wonderful thing that. I mean, the danger when you make a long-running show is that you get bored yourself with the way you're doing it. The audience doesn't. They're very happy to have the same thing. And I did worry that when I said to Chris, why don't we just do this all on a brass band? I mean, there was a justification of the brass band because it was set on a seafront hotel. And
so that was your idea?
Yes, it was my idea, and at the time I thought, am I just saying this because I'm fed up with the same orchestra each time, although we didn't have the same orchestra each time, it varied quite a lot. And I haven't listened or seen that episode for quite a long time, but I think it did work. How many people, other than a musician like yourself, would spot that it was continuously brass band for the whole of the 1 hour episode? I don't know, because of course they were playing the Poirot theme.
Exactly.
But it was a wonderful sight in the studio.
I bet.
There were 30 of them.
Really?
Yeah, I think well, maybe 25, I can't remember. You know, euphoniums, trumpets of various sizes, trombones, tubas. And Chris had done, not only written the music, but done these wonderful brass band arrangements, and fantastic players came. I mean, people from all the London orchestras, and the sound in the studio, I mean, and it's replicated on the episode, but was just beautiful playing. And you know how a cornet player really makes that trumpet sound sing. It's almost like a voice, isn't
Definitely.
it? And we had a lovely cornet player, and but yeah, we did do. I'm trying to remember. Oh well, there were a couple of French episodes, aren't there?
Yeah.
So we did a sort of French band in there for those with a piano accordion. The lineup was basically the same for each episode. With the specially tuned piano, which gave it a slightly unusual feel to it, and of course the saxophone, which was, you know, it was quite interesting right from the start. When Chris wrote the tune, we were debating what instrument to play it on, because it could have been any number of solo instruments, and I think I'm right in saying that the first demo we made of it was with a soprano sax. And I remember bringing it home and Christabel, my wife, saying, that sounds too high. You should be on a tenor rather than on a soprano. And I relayed that to Chris, and we both thought, yes, that was right. And then we moved it down to the tenor, and that was much better.
Yeah. It's a fantastic theme tune.
Oh, yes.
I mean, it just so suits the whole thing, because it echoes what you're doing as well. There's mystery in it. It sounds a little bit continental, and there's humour. There's a bit of cheekiness in it, which of course comes across in the production. So you must have been so pleased when that all came together like that.
Yes, I'm trying to remember whether I was able to show Chris any footage before he wrote it. I don't think I was, because I can remember playing David the demo we made of it almost on the first episode of shooting. See, the trouble is, when you're making 10 episodes and they're going out weekly, you have to have everything ready, because, I mean, often they'd be broadcasting episodes before we had finished shooting the series. Because, that's 10 weeks, so, I mean, it would take us about 4 to 5 weeks, I think, to finish an episode. Once we finished shooting the editing and the sound and the music and everything, that was about a 4 or 5 week schedule afterwards. But they were often very keen to get the series on the air, so as soon as they had some episodes, they would start, and we would be galloping to catch up to get them finished. So on that first series, I had to have the signature tune and the general idea for the music ready, as soon as we finished shooting the first episode. And the same thing with the title sequence. I think we shot David's elements of the title sequence, just his walking away, which we did in a great big studio at Twickenham, so we'd get all the distance on it. I think we shot that between episode 1 and episode 2.
Really?
Yeah, because we just needed it there and then. Because Pat Gavin, who was the designer of the titles, he had lots of work to do with all the elements, so he needed several weeks after that. So I think Chris probably just wrote that tune based on what I was telling him about the show, what he'd read of Agatha Christie. So it wasn't actually a direct result of seeing the visuals.
No, he just had the right creative visual himself
he
for
did,
it.
He did, yeah.
Absolutely, that's wonderful. If you had an Art Deco memento from the show, what would you choose if you were offered something?
In the flat, on the end wall, there were those bookshelves with the curves on them, with some lovely little ornaments on. I remember those specifically. The art department and the props department, once they got into it, were very, very good. They would come in and say, look, we found this little piece and that's so of the period, how can we use that? So we would try and get it in shot or even get it written into the script.
My favourite episode, it's very difficult when you have to have a favourite, but if I'm asked on the spot, I would say The Adventures of the Clapham Cook, because I just think you get that feeling you're about to embark on something really special. This is worth staying in every Sunday evening for. This is really lovely. So you feel excited by that, you really do. And I love the opening scene, when we first meet them and the camera pans up the spats of Poirot. It's just brilliant. So for me, that's probably one of my favourites. It must be very difficult for you to choose, but if you had to choose your favourite that you worked on.
It's not easy to say.
No.
I mean, Clapham Cook was not the first one we shot.
Oh, okay.
It was the
That's
first one we
interesting.
transmitted. I think it was the second we shot. I can't quite remember. But the director of that, man called Ed Bennett, he was really the designer of that whole thing you're talking about. The camera going up the legs and revealing and everything. And he did a very, very good job of that. And it was a good way to introduce the characters, even though we hadn't initially meant that to be the first episode. It also has a line that we always used to laugh about. They go up north somewhere, don't they? I can't remember where, to Yorkshire somewhere, and they're walking.
Keswick.
Is it Keswick? Yes,
Yeah.
okay. And they're walking across the countryside, which Poirot hates, and his feet are going in the mud and all of that.
That's
he
right.
grumbles on about how awful it is in the country, which is full of, I can't remember this, that, and little furry things,
Yes.
he says. And David and I always used to have a chuckle about little furry things all the time.
It was
which-
wonderful. The way that, he wanted to fill his lungs with London air and
Yes,
all this
that's right,
fresh country
that's right,
air.
Yes, I mean, although that is all very Poirot, I think that's probably all invented by Clive Exton. I don't think that's
Really?
out of the Christie book. That's just him building on
Yeah.
the Christie character.
Okay.
But what would I say? Well, because so many episodes had little special things that I was keen to do, lots of them are special. But one that really, I think, works very well, it was a 2-hour episode, the ABC Murders. But of course, the reason why that works well is that it is very, very different from many of Agatha's stories. Most Agatha stories are some sort of prequel. You meet a group of people, you don't know much about them, you get a little bit of history. One of them dies, and somebody says, call for Poirot, and he comes and starts asking about it, and you learn a little bit more, and eventually he works out who did it. I mean, that's a very crude structure. On ABC Murders, somebody dies, and Poirot gets involved, and then somebody else dies. And then he gets letters saying, and more people are going to die, and indeed more people die. So the story has a terrific forward momentum. I mean, his motive in that story is, how can I stop the next person dying? Whereas his motive in most of the stories is, how can I work out who killed the person who died beforehand? And that forward momentum is what really propels that story and makes it, I think, more engrossing in a way. Although we always tried to make the looking back stories engrossing. And indeed, sometimes we would introduce, if not another murder, certainly another crime that would try and lead you towards deciphering who had actually done it.
And that writing, I mean, Agatha Christie, how she did it, because I read that she used to write an entire book in her head and plot the whole thing out before she actually started typing.
Yes,
I don't know.
I
How
don't
did
know
she do
whether
that?
that's completely the case in all the books. And of course, there is this big difference between the short stories and the novels. I think with the short story, you probably couldn't start that without knowing where you were going, because you were only going to, I mean, they were published in magazines or in a little collection of short stories. But with a novel, I don't know, when we studied them for dramatisation, you would think to yourself, well, all the evidence is heading in this direction, and then suddenly something would get thrown in and would push you on another direction. So I don't know whether Agatha had that in her mind, or whether a lot of authors do this. They start with a set of circumstances and a set of characters, and they see where it leads them. I mean, I expect Agatha will have had in her mind the method by which somebody died, because she was very interested in all of that, wasn't she?
Yeah.
But whether she necessarily knew for sure who her killer was at the start sounds a bit of a strange thing to suggest that she didn't, but I suspect she might have switched horses from time to time and said, you know what, I don't think it was him, I think it was her. Just because it made a more interesting story to switch it around like that.
Always kept us guessing.
Yeah,
always,
definitely, yes.
Every time.
And the important thing on the television adaptations was to retain that. The last thing you wanted was people to be knowing for certain halfway through who had done it. But also the reverse of that was true. I always thought it was very, very unfair if at the end, when you revealed who had done it, people were saying, well, I never could have guessed that. There wasn't enough evidence for that. I've been misled. So it was striking a balance between laying enough clues that you could justify your solution without revealing so much that people would easily guess the solution.
Where is Poirot popular in the world? So obviously America know about it.
Oh yes, it's sold everywhere. I subsequently did some work with Richard Attenborough. I made the Shadowlands movie with Dickie, and I remember we were in Beverly Hills Hotel or something, setting up that film, and there was a studio executive there, and Dickie was very, very good. I mean, obviously he was a very, very big name, and he'd won his Oscar for Gandhi and all of that. But I remember him introducing me to this executive. He said, this is Brian, who brought us this film. And he said, you know, Brian produces the Agatha Christie Poirots. And I was very surprised that this, he said, I watch those every Sunday night on PBS. You know, PBS, that world in America is completely different from the American studio world, but they did all know about it there.
What do you think was its main appeal?
Oh, it's got to be the Agatha stories, hasn't it? That's what attracts you to begin with, but then all the layers that we were able to add to it. But I mean, there are a lot of very successful Agatha adaptations now, aren't they? Non-Poirot ones, the ones the BBC do, the 3 or 4 parters at Christmas or New Year. I mean, they do them in a very different style, and they don't have the same lead actors or anything like that, but people watch them in big numbers. So her storytelling is the first thing.
Yeah.
But then David's performance, the character of Poirot, which, you know, is obviously Agatha's character, but I think as enlarged by Clive, who wrote most of the scripts, and not all of them at all. Anthony Horowitz wrote a lot of scripts subsequently, and he was very good at building on the character as well. But then when you start to add in the look and the architecture and the supporting cast, those are all extra ingredients that make a lovely rich mixture, I think. Definitely so.
And I have to say, my son, Harry, he grew up loving it as well, and he would watch it. And I must just show you this. World Book Day, you know, at schools, and they have to dress up on World Book Day.
Oh,
they
yeah,
have to choose their character. And that's who he chose.
Have a look. Well, that's his future, isn't it? And look, he's got the little pin as well.
I know, because he said, I need that, Mum. And I said, well, I'll make something. And I remember rolling up a bit of foil and...
So we're talking about this little pin on the corner there.
And even the spats are genuine spats that I managed to find.
It's great, isn't it, that the kids do love it.
They do.
We had several young godchildren at the time that we were making both Poirot and Jeeves and Wooster, and they always went out on Sunday nights, and several of them would ring after the episode to say how much they'd enjoyed it and all of that. Now we are 30 years later. They've grown up, they've got married, and now they're showing the DVDs to their kids. So when we go around and see them, they're saying, oh, we saw one of your old films there and we love it today. So it's very, very nice that it has stood the test of time.
Definitely.
you wonder when you see the glut of material on television now and all these streaming services. Will that continue? Can you imagine in 30 years from now they'd still be watching those episodes? Because the techniques are so different now, the way stories are told on television so much faster, and time zones all interlapping and all of that sort of thing. It's hard to know, but I mean, for goodness sake, we still watch movies from the 30s and 40s, don't we?
We do.
So you'd like to think that there would be some television that would carry on.
I think so too. A little bit about your childhood, Brian. I mean, what did you want to do when you grew up? Did you want to be? Did you think about TV then, or what was in your mind then?
No. I think I didn't know what a producer was. No. But I think I always felt I wanted to be that sort of person. I mean, when you're a teenager, you don't really know about these things, do you? But I was always, I was involved a lot in music at school and at college. I was always putting on concerts and organising things like that. And then I did have a career in the classical music business to start with. When I left university, I was concert manager at the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra. And then I worked at the British Council. I used to take music tours all over the world, with all different sorts of musicians. And then I started making films about music. That's how I got into it. I made documentaries, firstly of some of the tours that I did, and then of other things. And then I worked with a director, and that was still a time where you could make shorts for the cinema. Remember, they used to show the British-made things. And we got a chance to make a couple of dramas for cinema. And then Channel 4 came along and they wanted independent producers, and we just started by then, really. So we started making things for Channel 4. So
that's wonderful. So music played a major part.
Yes, it did, and has always been a big thing on the shows that I've all done. Yes.
Do you play an instrument?
I used to play a bassoon.
Oh, really?
I did, yeah.
That's a marvellous instrument to play.
It is.
It's amazing.
I haven't played for ages. I did get my grade 8 on bassoon, but I did a little bit of conducting but more organising. I mean, when I was with the RPO, I was not playing at all. I was just being a concert manager.
Well, Brian, thank you very much for joining me this evening, and it's been wonderful to learn more about all of your work, not only Poirot, which is wonderful, will always stay with me and my son, and I reckon when he grows up, he will share it with his children, I'm sure of it. So it will definitely stick around. Thank you once again, Brian.
Thank you, Kate. Thanks a lot.